Captain Ethan Cross woke up to the sound of his head pounding in rhythm with what he assumed were the ship's engines, until he realized the engines belonged to a Kalahari warship and his head was pounding because someone had knocked him unconscious during his capture. The detention cell was exactly what he'd expected from a species known for turning warfare into an art form, efficient, secure, and decorated with the kind of intimidating symbols that suggested the previous occupants hadn't left voluntarily. The walls were a deep metallic gray that seemed to absorb light, and the energy field humming across the cell entrance cast everything in an eerie blue glow. "Well," Ethan said to the empty cell, "this is definitely not how I planned to spend my Tuesday." His reconnaissance mission in the disputed Vegas sector had been routine surveillance, monitor Kalahari ship movements, gather intelligence, avoid contact. Standard procedure for the kind of work that kept the uneasy peace between human and Kalahari territories from erupting into full-scale war. Unfortunately, someone had forgotten to mention that the Kalahari had recently upgraded their sensor technology. The cell door chimed softly, and Ethan looked up to see the energy field deactivate. He'd been expecting an interrogator, possibly accompanied by whatever passed for enhanced questioning techniques in Kalahari culture. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who made him immediately reconsider everything he thought he knew about captivity. Commander Zarakai was exactly the kind of Kalahari warrior that featured in human military briefings about threats to be avoided at all costs. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of athletic build that suggested she could probably bench press a shuttle, and her deep crimson skin was marked with the ritual scars that indicated elite combat status. Her pointed ears swept back from her temples, and her dark hair was bound in the practical braids favored by Kalahari military personnel. But it was her eyes that caught Ethan's attention, deep amber, studying him with an intensity that felt more like evaluation than hostility. "Captain Cross," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that made Kalahari speech sound like music played on unfamiliar instruments. "I am Commander Zarakai. You will come with me." "Let me guess," Ethan said, standing slowly and testing his balance. "Interrogation time. I should probably mention that I'm terrible at keeping secrets under pressure. Very disappointing prisoner, really." Zarakai's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been amusement flickering across her features. "You will not be interrogated." "Execution then?" "Because I have to say, this seems like a lot of ceremony for a simple execution. I was expecting something more immediate." "You will not be executed." Ethan paused, studying her face for clues about what exactly was happening. "Okay, I'll bite. If not interrogation or execution, what exactly am I here for? Extended vacation in scenic Kalahari detention facilities? You are under my protection." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. In all his years of military service, in all the briefings about Kalahari culture and customs, he'd never heard of enemy prisoners being placed under protection. "I'm sorry, under your what?" "Protection," Zarakai repeated, as if this explained everything. "You will remain in quarters adjacent to mine. You will be provided with appropriate food, medical care, and accommodation according to your status." "My status as a prisoner?" "Your status as Shataith." Ethan's Kalahari language training was limited, but he was fairly certain that wasn't a word that appeared in any human Kalahari dictionary. "I don't know what that means." Zarakai stepped aside, gesturing for him to exit the cell. "Come. I will explain while you eat." As they walked through the corridors of the Kalahari warship, Ethan became increasingly aware that something unusual was happening. The other crew members they passed didn't treat him like a prisoner, they stepped aside respectfully, some even offering what appeared to be small bows in his direction. More confusing still, they seemed to defer to Zarakai in a way that suggested this wasn't just military hierarchy. "Commander," Ethan said as they entered what appeared to be private quarters rather than another detention area, "I think there's been some kind of mistake." "No mistake." Zarakai gestured to a table where food had been arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for honored guests. "Sit. Eat. We will discuss your situation." The food was surprisingly good, some kind of protein that tasted like chicken, vegetables that were familiar enough not to be alarming, and a drink that reminded him of spiced tea. Ethan ate while Zarakai watched him with that same intense evaluation, as if his dining habits revealed crucial information about his character. "This is excellent," he said finally. "Much better than prison food. Though I have to ask, are you planning to keep me as some kind of pet? Because I should warn you, I'm not house-trained and I have terrible habits." The comment earned him what was definitely amusement this time, a slight smile that transformed Zarakai's entire face. "You are not a pet. Then what am I?" Zarakai was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes studying his face as if searching for something. 3 months ago, your ship saved my life." Ethan paused with food halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry, what?" "During the skirmish in the Kepler system. Your reconnaissance vessel transmitted emergency medical data when my fighter was damaged. That information allowed me to treat plasma burns that would have killed me before rescue arrived." Ethan set down his fork, his mind racing through the events of 3 months ago. There had been a brief engagement with Kalahari fighters, nothing major, just the usual territorial posturing that kept both sides from getting too comfortable. Standard protocol called for broadcasting emergency medical assistance on open channels during any combat situation, in case there were survivors in need of aid. "That was just standard procedure," he said slowly. "We broadcast medical information during all engagements. It's basic humanitarian protocol." "Intent is irrelevant," Zarakai said firmly. "The result is what matters. Your actions saved my life, which places me in your debt according to Kalahari honor law." "Honor law?" "Shataith. Life debt. Until the debt is repaid, I am bound to serve and protect you with my life." Ethan stared at her, feeling the universe shift around him like the deck plates of a ship in a gravity well. "You're saying that because my ship sent out standard medical information, you now belong to me? I am oath-bound to your service until you release me from the debt or I die fulfilling it." "That's..." Ethan struggled for words. "That's insane. That is honor." The simple statement carried such conviction that Ethan found himself reconsidering his entire understanding of the situation. This wasn't some elaborate Kalahari interrogation technique or psychological warfare. Zarakai genuinely believed she owed him her life, and in her culture, that apparently came with obligations he was completely unprepared for. "What if I don't want a life debt?" he asked. "What if I just want to go home?" "The debt exists regardless of your desires," Zarakai said. "Though you may certainly return to human space. I would accompany you, of course, until such time as the obligation is fulfilled." Ethan tried to imagine explaining to his commanding officers that he'd accidentally acquired a Kalahari warrior who considered herself his personal bodyguard. This is going to be complicated. Most worthwhile things are. Something in her tone made him look up, and he caught an expression on her face that seemed almost hopeful. As if the prospect of this bizarre arrangement wasn't entirely unwelcome to her. "Commander Zarakai," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you actually upset about this life debt thing? Because you seem almost pleased about it." The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment her warrior composure slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "The debt is an honor," she said quietly. "To serve one who saved my life without thought of reward or recognition, there are worse fates for a warrior. Such as dying without purpose. Living without honor. Serving those unworthy of service." She met his eyes directly. "You have proven yourself worthy, even unknowingly." Ethan felt something warm and confusing settle in his chest. "I'm just a reconnaissance pilot who happened to follow standard protocols." "You are the reason I still draw breath," Zarakai said simply. "That makes you more important to me than admirals, generals, or kings." Before Ethan could figure out how to respond to that declaration, the quarter's communication system chimed. Zarakai activated it with a gesture, and the voice of another Kalahari filled the room. "Commander Zarakai, report to the bridge." The captain wishes to discuss the disposition of the human prisoner. Acknowledged, Zarakai replied. She turned to Ethan. Remain here. You will be safe in these quarters. And if someone decides they don't care about your life debt protection? Zarakai's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Then they will learn why I earned these scars. As she left, Ethan sat alone in quarters that were apparently now his, eating food prepared by someone who considered herself bound to his service, and wondering how a routine reconnaissance mission had turned into the most complicated situation of his military career. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled past in patterns he didn't recognize, carrying him further from everything familiar and deeper into a future he couldn't have imagined. And the most disturbing part? As he thought about Zarakai's fierce loyalty and her genuine conviction that protecting him was an honor rather than a burden, he found himself hoping that whatever came next would give him time to understand this remarkable woman who just turned his world upside down. Ethan spent the next 2 hours exploring his new quarters and coming to terms with the fact that he was probably the only human in the galaxy whose biggest problem was having a Kalahari warrior who considered his safety her personal responsibility. The quarters were spacious by military standards, with a sleeping area, a small workspace, and what appeared to be a meditation corner complete with weapons rack. The weapons rack gave him pause. Apparently Zarakai was comfortable enough with his presence to keep her personal armory in the same space where he'd be sleeping. Either she trusts me completely, he muttered to himself, or she's confident enough in her abilities that armed proximity isn't a concern. Given what he'd observed of her physical presence, he was betting on the latter. When Zarakai returned from her meeting with the captain, she found Ethan studying the collection of bladed weapons with the careful attention of someone trying not to accidentally start an international incident. Those are ceremonial, she said, moving to secure the weapons with practiced efficiency. My combat gear is stored separately. Ceremonial weapons, Ethan repeated. Do I want to know what ceremonies require that many different ways to cut things? Coming-of-age trials, honor duels, victory celebrations, funeral rites. Zarakai paused in her organizing. Debt-binding ceremonies. Debt-binding ceremonies. The formal recognition of life debt obligations. Though in our case, the debt was established by action rather than ceremony. She turned to face him. The captain has agreed to honor my claim of protection, but he is concerned about the political implications. Ethan settled into one of the chairs, noting that even the furniture seemed designed for people who expected to need to fight their way out of rooms at a moment's notice. Political implications. A Kalahari warrior bound in service to a human prisoner creates questions about loyalty and priorities. Some of the crew believe I should fulfill the debt quickly and release you, rather than maintaining long-term protection. How does one fulfill a life debt quickly? Zarakai's expression grew serious. By placing oneself in mortal danger to protect the debt holder, thus balancing the scales of obligation. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. You mean by getting yourself killed protecting me? Death in service would fulfill the obligation honorably. That's horrible. That is sacrifice. Zarakai moved to the small food preparation area, her movements precise and controlled. Though I confess I prefer the alternative. Which is long-term service until you choose to release me from the debt. She began preparing what appeared to be tea with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. It allows for a more comprehensive expression of gratitude. Ethan watched her work, noting the way her hands moved with deadly grace even while performing domestic tasks. Zarakai, can I ask you something personal? You may ask anything. Do you actually want to be bound to me? Not because of honor or duty, but personally. Because this whole situation seems like it could be inconvenient for someone with a military career. Zarakai paused in her tea preparation, her back still turned to him. That is a complicated question. I'm good with complicated. She finished her preparation and turned to face him, holding 2 cups of steaming liquid that smelled like cinnamon and something floral. In Kalahari culture, life debts are considered gifts. The opportunity to serve someone who preserved your existence is seen as a chance to find purpose beyond personal ambition. That sounds like the official answer. The official answer is true. She handed him a cup and settled into the chair across from him. But it is not complete. What's the complete answer? Zarakai sipped her tea, her amber eyes studying him over the rim of her cup. The complete answer is that in 3 months of carrying this debt, I have found myself curious about the human who saved my life without knowing I existed. When your ship was captured and I learned you were aboard, I felt anticipation. Anticipation? The chance to finally meet the person whose actions gave me a future. She set down her cup. And having met you, I find myself hoping that future will be longer rather than shorter. Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the tea. Even though I'm apparently a disappointment as a prisoner. You are not a prisoner. And you are certainly not a disappointment. Zarakai's voice carried a note of something that might have been affection. You face an impossible situation with humor rather than despair, you show concern for my welfare despite your own circumstances, and you ask thoughtful questions about customs you do not understand. Those seem like pretty basic human behaviors. They are behaviors that suggest character. In my experience, character under pressure reveals true nature. She leaned forward slightly. Your true nature appears to be kindness, intelligence, and remarkable adaptability. You're evaluating my character. I am learning about the person I am bound to serve. It seems prudent. Ethan found himself smiling. And your evaluation so far? Favorable. The simple word carried enough warmth to make Ethan reconsider everything he thought he knew about Kalahari emotional expression. Zarakai, what happens if I don't want to release you from this debt? Not because I want to keep you bound to me, but because, well, because I'm starting to think I'd like to get to know you better. The question seemed to catch her off guard. You would want to maintain the bond. I'd want to see if the bond could become something freely chosen rather than culturally imposed. Zarakai went very still, her cup frozen halfway to her lips. That would be unusual. Unusual how? Life debts typically end in release or death. They do not typically evolve into other arrangements. What if this one did? Then it would be unprecedented. She set down her cup with deliberate care. And potentially wonderful. Before Ethan could respond to that loaded statement, the quarter's communication system chimed again. This time, the voice carried an edge of hostility that made both of them tense. Commander Zarakai, Subcommander Thekvar requests immediate audience regarding the disposition of the human captive. Zarakai's expression hardened into something that reminded Ethan why Kalahari warriors had such fearsome reputations. Subcommander Thekvar will wait. The matter is urgent, Commander. All matters concerning my Shataith are my responsibility alone. Thekvar will wait. The communication ended abruptly, leaving them in tense silence. Friend of yours? Ethan asked, trying to lighten the mood. Political rival, Zarakai said grimly. Thekvar believes that maintaining life debt protection for a human enemy weakens Kalahari military authority. And he wants to do something about it. He wants to challenge my right to maintain the debt. Which would require. She trailed off, her expression growing troubled. Would require what? Combat trial. Single combat to determine whether my claim of protection is valid under Kalahari honor law. Ethan felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. And if you lose? Then I would no longer be able to protect you, and you would be subject to standard prisoner protocols. Which are? Interrogation followed by execution or imprisonment until the war ends. Ethan set down his teacup with hands that weren't quite steady. How good are you in single combat? Zarakai's smile was sharp and predatory. Very good. But Thekvar is also skilled, and he has the advantage of fighting for what he believes is Kalahari honor rather than personal obligation. What can I do to help? The question seemed to surprise her. You would help me fight for your own protection. I'd help you fight for what's right. And keeping me alive seems pretty right from my perspective. There is nothing you can do directly. Combat trials must be fought alone. But tactical advice from someone with your strategic background could be valuable. Ethan leaned forward, his mind already shifting into planning mode. Tell me about Thekvar's fighting style. As Zarakai began describing her rival's combat techniques, Ethan found himself thinking that 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been filing reconnaissance reports on time. Now he was planning tactics to help an alien warrior fight for his life, and somehow that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was the way Zarakai's eyes lit up when she talked strategy, or the way she unconsciously included him in her planning as if his opinion actually mattered. Or maybe it was the growing realization that somewhere between being her protected charge and watching her prepare to risk everything for his safety, he'd started falling for the fierce dedication in her amber eyes. Either way, he was definitely in deeper than he'd ever planned to be. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Ethan was reviewing Kalahari combat protocols on Zarakai's personal terminal when the quarters door chimed urgently. Zarakai answered to find Sub-Commander Thekvar flanked by 4 armed warriors, their expressions suggesting this wasn't a social visit. Commander Zarakai, Thekvar said, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that preceded unpleasant announcements. By order of the War Council, I am here to assume custody of the human prisoner. The human is under my protection, Zarakai replied, her hand moving subtly toward her weapon. He is not subject to general custody. Your protection is no longer recognized. Thekvar held up a data pad displaying official seals. The Council has determined that maintaining life debt obligations to enemy combatants compromises ship security and warrior honor. Ethan watched the exchange with growing alarm, noting the way the armed warriors had positioned themselves to control the room's exits. Excuse me, he said, standing slowly with his hands visible, but shouldn't the person this concerns have some input in the discussion? Thekvar's gaze shifted to him with undisguised contempt. Prisoners do not speak at Kalahari military proceedings. Actually, Ethan said, his mind racing through everything Zarakai had taught him about honor protocols. According to the precedents she showed me, Shataith holders have the right to witness any proceedings that affect their protection status. The statement clearly caught Thekvar off guard. You cannot claim Shataith rights. You are not Kalahari. The debt exists regardless of species, Zarakai said, her voice growing dangerous. And the debt holder's rights are absolute under honor law. Honor law that you are perverting for personal gain, Thekvar snapped. This human saved your life through accident, not intention. The debt is invalid. Intent is irrelevant to outcome, Zarakai replied. The law is clear. The law is open to interpretation. Then let it be interpreted through trial. The words came from Ethan, surprising everyone including himself. If Sub-Commander Thekvar believes Commander Zarakai's protection is invalid, let him prove it according to Kalahari tradition. Thekvar's eyes narrowed. You would call for combat trial? I would call for proper resolution according to honor law rather than political convenience. The challenge hung in the air like a blade, and Ethan could see Zarakai's surprise at his understanding of the cultural dynamics. He'd been paying attention during their strategy discussions, and he'd learned that Kalahari honor culture valued direct challenge over bureaucratic maneuvering. You cannot call for trial, Thekvar said. You are not Kalahari. But I can, Zarakai said, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. And I do. I call for combat trial to determine the validity of my Shataith claim under ancient law. The formal words seemed to transform the situation from political confrontation to ritual challenge. Thekvar's warriors stepped back slightly, recognizing the shift from military action to honor protocol. You would risk your life for this human? Thekvar asked. I would risk my life for honor, Zarakai corrected. The human's welfare is simply the form that honor takes. Then you will have your trial. Thekvar's smile was cold. And when you fall, this matter will be settled permanently. After they left, Ethan found himself alone with Zarakai and the sudden realization that his attempt to help might have just made everything worse. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to escalate the situation." "You did not escalate," Zarakai replied, moving to her weapons rack with purposeful efficiency. "You provided the honorable solution to an impossible situation. By getting you into a fight that could get you killed. By ensuring that if I must fight, it will be according to law rather than political pressure." She selected a curved blade that seemed to hum with its own energy. Trial by combat is the purest form of Kalahari justice. What if you lose? Zarakai turned to face him, her expression serious but not afraid. Then I will have died honorably, and you will face whatever comes next with the knowledge that someone considered you worth fighting for. That's not particularly comforting. It is not meant to be comforting. It is meant to be honest. She moved closer, her amber eyes studying his face. "Ethan, there is something you should understand about this trial." "What?" "Win or lose, it changes everything between us. If I survive, the debt will be considered tested and proven valid. But the trial itself demonstrates that my commitment goes beyond legal obligation." Ethan felt his heart rate increase. "Meaning?" "Meaning that I am not fighting for duty anymore. I am fighting for choice." The words hit him like a physical impact. "Zarakai. I know this complicates matters. But facing possible death has a way of clarifying priorities." She reached out to touch his face gently. "I want you to know that whatever happens in the trial, my feelings for you are real." "Your feelings? Did you think I arranged your quarters adjacent to mine purely for security purposes? Or that I prepared your meals personally because of duty?" Her smile was soft but determined. "I have been courting you, Ethan Cross, in the only way my culture and circumstances allowed." "Courting me?" "The attentive care, the personal service, the gradual sharing of private space and personal information. In Kalahari culture, these are traditional courtship behaviors." Ethan stared at her. "You've been dating me?" "I have been indicating romantic interest and evaluating compatibility for potential long-term bonding. And I thought you were just being professional." "I am never just anything." Zarakai's smile widened. "Though I will admit that using life debt protection as a courtship framework is somewhat unconventional." Before Ethan could figure out how to respond to the revelation that he'd been accidentally dating a Kalahari warrior, the communication system announced that the combat trial would begin in 1 hour. 1 hour, Ethan said, feeling panic rise in his chest. "That's not much time." "It is sufficient." Zarakai moved to her equipment storage, pulling out armor that looked like it had been forged from starlight and determination. "Though I would appreciate your tactical insights." "My insights?" "You have been studying Thekvar's combat patterns. Your strategic mind sees details that warrior training might overlook." As Ethan helped her prepare for combat, checking armor seals and reviewing Thekvar's known techniques, he found himself marveling at the impossible turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a simple reconnaissance pilot. Now he was providing tactical support to an alien warrior who was about to risk her life fighting for the right to court him. "Zarakai," he said as she made final adjustments to her weapons. "After the trial, assuming you win, what happens to us?" "That depends on you." She turned to face him, fully armored and radiating the kind of lethal competence that made enemy fleets reconsider their life choices. "Do you want to find out what happens when a Kalahari warrior courts someone she's already willing to die for?" Ethan looked at this remarkable woman who turned his capture into protection, his imprisonment into courtship, and his certain death into a fighting chance, and felt something settle into place in his chest. "Yes," he said simply. "I really do." Her smile could have powered a starship. "Then I had better not lose." As they walked toward the combat arena, Ethan realized that somewhere between being her prisoner and becoming her chosen partner, he'd stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about building a future. And if that future required surviving a trial by combat against a Kalahari sub-commander who wanted him dead, well, he'd faced worse odds. Actually, he hadn't faced worse odds. But he'd never had a Kalahari warrior fighting for him before, and something told him that made all the difference. The combat arena was a circular chamber deep in the ship's core, surrounded by observation galleries filled with crew members who'd gathered to witness the trial. Ethan found himself in the position of honor beside the ship's captain, watching as Zarakai and Thekvar entered the combat circle from opposite sides. "This is highly irregular," Captain Vektar murmured, his scarred hands gripping the gallery railing. "Combat trials for life debt protection are rare enough. Trials involving alien debt holders are unprecedented." "Everything about this situation is unprecedented," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving Zarakai as she performed the ritual weapon checks required before combat. But then, the best things usually are. In the arena below, Zarakai moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with violence as a form of communication. Her armor caught the arena's lighting, making her look like a figure from warrior legend. Thekvar, by contrast, approached combat with the methodical precision of someone who viewed fighting as a technical problem to be solved efficiently. "The trial begins when both combatants signal readiness," Captain Vektar explained. "It ends when one yields, is incapacitated, or dies." "Dies?" Ethan's stomach dropped. "I thought this was about honor, not execution. Honor sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. Though Zarakai is skilled enough to avoid that outcome." "How skilled?" "She has never lost a formal combat trial." Below them, both warriors signaled their readiness, and the trial began with the kind of explosive violence that reminded Ethan why humans generally try to avoid direct confrontation with Kalahari military personnel. Thekvar attacked first, his blade work displaying the precise technique of someone trained in multiple combat styles. But Zarakai moved like water around his strikes, her own weapons creating patterns that seemed to predict his attacks before he made them. "She's reading his style," Ethan said, recognizing the tactical approach they'd discussed. "Using his aggression against him. You understand Kalahari combat theory? She taught me. Said that understanding how she fights would help me understand how she thinks." The captain gave him a sidelong glance. "And how does she think?" "Like someone who considers every possibility and prepares for all of them." Ethan watched Zarakai deflect a series of increasingly desperate attacks from Thekvar. But who's willing to improvise when the situation changes? As if summoned by his words, Zarakai suddenly shifted tactics, moving from defensive responses to calculated offense. Her blade work became a blur of motion that forced Thekvar back toward the arena's edge. "She's winning," Ethan said, hardly daring to believe it. "She is demonstrating superior skill," the captain corrected. "But Thekvar fights for what he believes is racial honor. Desperation can overcome technique." The captain's words proved prophetic. Thekvar, realizing he was losing the formal duel, suddenly abandoned proper combat protocols and launched himself at Zarakai in a brutal close-quarters attack that sacrificed defense for overwhelming aggression. The arena erupted in shocked murmurs from the watching crew. Abandoning honor protocols during a formal trial was a serious breach of warrior code, but it was also potentially effective if it caught the opponent off guard. It didn't catch Zarakai off guard. She stepped into Thekvar's reckless charge, used his momentum against him, and ended the fight with a single precise strike that left him unconscious on the arena floor but very much alive. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of respect that followed truly exceptional displays of martial skill. "Trial concluded," Captain Vektar announced formally. "Commander Zarakai's claim of Shataith protection is validated under honor law." The crew's cheers filled the arena, but Ethan only had eyes for Zarakai as she removed her helmet and looked up at the observation gallery. When their eyes met, her smile held enough warmth to power the ship's engines. Later, back in their quarters, Ethan helped Zarakai remove her armor while she provided a detailed analysis of the combat that reminded him why he'd fallen for her mind as much as her physical prowess. "Thekvar's final attack was predictable," she said, wincing slightly as Ethan helped her out of the chest piece. "Desperation makes warriors abandon strategy in favor of overwhelming force." "You knew he'd try something like that?" I hoped he would. It gave me the opportunity to end the fight without seriously injuring him. She turned to face him, her amber eyes serious. Killing him would have solved the immediate problem but created long-term political complications. Always thinking 3 moves ahead. Always thinking about consequences. She moved closer, her hand coming up to touch his face gently. Which brings us to an important decision. What decision? Captain Vector has received new orders. The ship is being assigned to escort duty for a joint human-Kalahari diplomatic mission. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Diplomatic mission? The first formal attempt at establishing permanent peace treaties between our species. They need personnel with experience in cross-cultural communication and conflict resolution. That sounds like it would require people who understand both cultures pretty well. People like a human communications officer and a Kalahari warrior who have successfully navigated the transition from enemy captive to whatever we are now. Ethan studied her face, noting the careful way she'd phrased the offer. What are we now? That depends on your answer to the captain's offer. Zarakai's voice carried a note of vulnerability that reminded him how much courage it took to risk your heart along with your life. We could accept assignment to the diplomatic mission together. As partners rather than protector and protected. Partners? Bonded partners, if you're willing. The Kalahari equivalent of what humans call marriage, but with better armor and more clearly defined combat support roles. Ethan laughed, the sound carrying relief and joy in equal measure. Are you proposing to me? I am offering you the choice to make our bond permanent and freely chosen rather than culturally imposed. She smiled. Though if you prefer traditional human proposal customs, I could arrange something with flowers and uncomfortable formal wear. I think I prefer the Kalahari approach, Ethan said, pulling her into his arms. Direct, honest, and with full disclosure of the combat support expectations. Is that a yes? That's a yes to the mission, yes to the partnership, and yes to whatever comes next. He kissed her gently. Though I should probably warn you that I've never been married to a warrior before. I have never been bonded to someone who saved my life through accident and then chose to stay through intention. Zarakai's smile was radiant. I believe we will figure it out together. 6 months later, Ethan stood on the observation deck of Diplomatic Station Alpha, watching ships from a dozen different species dock at the facility's ports. His work had expanded from simple reconnaissance to helping establish communication protocols between multiple alien civilizations, and he discovered that accidentally becoming a prisoner of war had been the best career move of his life. The Centaurian delegation has arrived, Zarakai announced, joining him at the viewport. Her new position as Chief of Diplomatic Security kept her busy, but she still made time for their ritual evening observations of the endless dance of ships and stars. Centaurians, Ethan said thoughtfully. Didn't they specifically request human Kalahari joint negotiators? They find our partnership inspiring. Zarakai moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the unconscious ease of people who'd learned to move as a unit. Apparently, the story of the human prisoner who became a diplomatic partner has become somewhat legendary. Legendary? 3 different species have requested our specific team for their initial contact protocols. We are becoming the standard for successful cross-species relationship building. Ethan laughed. No pressure then. I prefer to think of it as job security. Zarakai squeezed his hand. Though I admit there are moments when I miss the simplicity of our early arrangement. When I was your prisoner. When protecting you was my only responsibility. She turned to face him, her amber eyes warm with affection. Now I must balance your welfare with diplomatic duties, station security, and the occasional urge to challenge visiting dignitaries to combat trials when they're rude to you. Has that been a problem? The Rigelian ambassador now addresses you with appropriate respect. What did you do? Nothing permanent. Just a brief demonstration of Kalahari negotiation techniques. Ethan shook his head, marveling at the fact that his life now included casual references to his wife intimidating alien diplomats for his honor. You know, when I first woke up in that detention cell, I never imagined any of this. What did you imagine? Interrogation, imprisonment, possibly execution. The usual consequences of being captured during a reconnaissance mission. And instead, I found someone who turned captivity into protection, duty into choice, and enemy into family. He pulled her closer, watching the stars whirl past the station in patterns that had become familiar and comforting. Sometimes the best things in life happen when you're least prepared for them. Sometimes the universe has better plans than the ones we make ourselves, Zarakai agreed. Though I still maintain that your ship's emergency medical protocols were the most fortunate accident in galactic history. For both of us. For everyone who benefits from the peace we're helping to build. She gestured toward the viewport, where ships from former enemy civilizations work together in the careful dance of diplomacy. Our bond has become proof that former enemies can become partners, allies, and eventually family. Ethan looked out at the impossible sight of peaceful cooperation among species that had been shooting at each other just months ago, then at the remarkable woman who'd shown him that the strongest bonds were often forged in the most unlikely circumstances. Not bad for someone who used to just translate messages and avoid personal connections, he said. Very impressive growth for someone who started as my prisoner, Zarakai replied with a smile that still made his heart skip beats. Your prisoner who became your savior who became your partner. My chosen partner, she corrected. The prisoner phase was an accident. Everything after that was choice. As they stood together watching the endless possibility of stars and ships and new beginnings, Ethan reflected that sometimes the best adventures began with the worst situations, and sometimes the strongest love grew from the most impossible circumstances. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone worth fighting for who was also willing to fight for you.